Now, welcome to my third lecture on consequentialism. Our first lecture was about the basic principles of consequentialism in general, and the second talk about the varieties of the consequentialist view, the hedonistic, the non-hedonistic, the agent relative, and the agent neutral view. Now, in this third lecture, we will talk about the basic consequentialist theories. The first is Epicureanism. Epicureanism is one philosophical school identified with consequentialism and named after its proponent and main philosopher Epicurus, who lived between 341 to 270 BC. This subscribes to the view that pain and pleasure alone have intrinsic value, making this an hedonistic view. So Epicureanism belongs to the hedonistic consequentialism, and that only the welfare of the agent of the action has moral value. So agent relative din siya, making this view agent relative. We can understand Epicureanism better in comparison to another philosophical school that can be categorized under this view, called Cyrenaicism of Aristippus, who lived between 435 to 356 BC. So these are the main differences between the two. As to duration and intensity of pleasure, Epicurus promotes long-lasting but less intense pleasures. That means, for Epicurus, he agreed with long-lasting but less intense. Ito, momentary but more intense pleasures. So, yung difference nila. So, with regard to duration and intensity. Okay. So, maganda rin naman ito for you to consider, no? If you have an action, if you're planning to do something pleasurable, okay, uh, tanongin yung sarili ninyo, is this long lasting? Okay? And less intense? Or is it momentary or more intense? Okay? Ang basic temptation natin nandito eh. So, most likely, we want more intense actions and tend to forget na yun, momentary lang siya. Okay? Like Agbartek, no? Intense kasi ang saya-saya ninyo for 2 to 3 hours, pero momentary lang 'yan, no? Kasi kinabukasan, you will be you missed a class, you failed to finish an assignment, you have hangover, your head is heavy, you cannot go to your yan. I agree with the notion na drinking and getting drunk is parang umuutang ka lang ng happiness mo from bukas. So hindi ka happy ngayon, so you want to be more happy. Saan mo kinukuha yung happiness? Sa future, no? Yung bukas sana na happiness mo, kinukuha mo na today. Pero bukas, hindi ka happy sa hangover. Okay? So magandang issue yan. Another difference between the two is, for Epicurus, promotes freedom from pain in mind and body by cultivating mental tranquility and healthy body. So yun yung focus ni Epicurus, ha? Freedom from pain, both mind and body. So, mental tranquility and mental and bodily health. Tapos, less intense but long-lasting yan. Oo nga naman, no? Pag may mental tranquility ka at healthy body, long-lasting. So, kung hindi mo inaabuso yung katawan mo sa bisyo, you might live longer. Pero yung kay Cyrenaicism, sensory pleasures, no? Ang kanyang focus. Immediately gratified, greatly intense but short-lived. Okay, so medyo usually you grow up wanting this eh. Pleasure kagad, no? Andito yung view na medyo relax ka lang, medyo wait lang. Alam niyo 'yan. Alam niyo yung difference ng dalawa. Kay Epicurus, passive pleasure. Ang focus ni Epicurus is at least man lang walang pain. Absence of pain. Pero kay Cyrenaicism, active pleasure. Ibig sabihin niya talaga, gratify pleasure. I want to experience it. Okay. Ang point kasi rito, pwede kasing walang pleasure pero at least man lang, walang pain. Dito kasi, pwedeng pleasure ka ng pleasure ng pleasure, pero pagkatapos niyan, nako, pain. Okay. Considerations. Pursuing active pleasure is frustrating and unsustainable because life does not offer enough. Ito naman yung viewed na ang problema dito. No? Nagdidisiplina ka sa sarili, pero hindi sustainable. Ito yung point niya, no? Active pleasure ka, pero hindi sustainable yan eh. Hindi talaga may provide ng buhay lahat-lahat ng pleasure na gusto mo. Ang sinasabi naman nitong isa, okay, pursue immediate pleasures because life is uncertain, but we must be in control of our pleasure because excessive pleasure leads to pain pa rin naman. Pero sinasabi niya, control ka ng control baka mamatay ka bukas. baka mas gusto mo ng, mas okay lang na gawin ko na ngayon, baka hindi ko na magawa bukas. Okay? Yun naman yung point ni Cyrenaicism. More on the disciplined view. Okay? Ito medyo, sige, manso. Yeah. Okay. Another theory is utilitarianism. So I was mentioning utilitarianism to you as one of the prominent consequentialist theories. Utilitarianism is the most influential form of consequentialism and is sometimes wrongly used interchangeably. Sometimes when you read some books, no, pag sinabi mong consequentialism, sinasabi na rin niya utilitarianism yan. Pero magkaiba. This is not true because utilitarianism has other aspects of which consequentialism is but one of the three. Okay. So ibig sabihin, when you speak of utilitarianism, there are these basic three elements na wala sa consequentialism. Ano to? Okay? Utilitarianism is consequentialist, welfarist, and aggregationist. Yung consequentialism natin, yung consequentialism natin is nandito lang siya sa point number 1. Meaning, consequentialism, although used interchangeably with utilitarianism, wala sa kanya ito. Yung dalawang to. While utilitarianism has all those three. Okay. So, hindi pareho ang utilitarianism at saka consequentialism. But let's look at those three aspects. First, utilitarianism is consequentialist. The morality of actions are based on consequences. Okay? But, utilitarianism is welfarist, meaning considers the morally relevant generally what benefits persons involved or how it improves the quality of their lives. Okay? So, medyo agent neutral tong si utilitarianism. And aggregationist, meaning the welfare it considers as morally relevant is the maximum aggregate, sum total of welfare of all affected persons. So, dapat yung maximum aggregate, yung sum total ng happiness or pleasure or goodness ang kinoconsider. Hindi yung pakonti-konti. Okay, hindi yung pakonti-konti. So, aggregationist, welfarist, and consequentialist ang utilitarianism. So, what is the maximum aggregate welfare to all affected persons? Yan ang tinatanong niya. Suppose that we have two courses of action, X and Y, variable, sabihin na lang natin. Getting the maximum aggregate welfare for all persons involved is as follows. So, if you are a utilitarian, this is how you're going to get the maximum aggregate good. Una, get the sum total of pleasures and the sum total of pains of action X. Okay, so let's have here action X, and here let's have action Y. So your two choices. Una, get the sum total of pleasures daw of action X and pain. So let's say action X, tinotal mo lahat yung kanyang pleasure and nagkaroon ka ng 10 pleasure, okay, and 3 pain. You get the sum total of pleasures by subtracting the sum total of pains from the pleasures. You get the By subtracting the sum total of pains from the sum total of pleasures, you get the net sum total of pleasures of action X to all affected persons. So, gagawin natin dyan is ito. Ima-minus mo yung pain from the pleasure. That means, ilan ang total aggregate pleasure ng X? 7. So, gawin mo rin yan kay action Y. No? Get the sum total of pleasure and the sum total of pains of action Y. Sabihin natin action Y has 12 pleasures. Tapos, by subtracting the total sum of pains, ilan ba yung pain ni action Y? Sabihin natin meron siyang intense, no? Maraming pleasure, pero sabihin natin 8 yung kanyang pain. Okay? By subtracting sum total of pain from the sum total of pleasure, you get the net sum total of pleasures to all affected persons for action Y. So, ima-minus natin na naman yung pleasure minus pain. Okay? 8 minus 12, that is ilan? 4. So, notice na ito yung total aggregate good or pleasure ng X at ito yung sum total aggregate good ng action Y. Compare the net sum total pleasures of actions X and Y. The greatest net sum of total pleasures is the maximum aggregate welfare to all persons involved. And hence, it is the morally right action to pursue. In this case, now that we have proven that mas mataas yung aggregate sum ng good ng action X compared to action 4, although mas marami siyang pleasure, okay? Kasi minsan, no, nakafocus lang tayo sa, daming pleasure. Wag na to kasi 10 lang yung pleasure. Hindi natin nakikita yung maraming pain. Okay? So, by computing that, utilitarianism showed us quantifiably na ito talaga yung mas better action. Okay. Gets nyo? Gets nyo yan. Okay. The greatest happiness principle is the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. This principle is not similar to rule of majority. Take note, baka sabihin yung parang democracy. Dahil ang kagustuhan ng marami yun ang good. The aggregate welfare can favor an individual against a group of people. Kasi there could be a case kasi na if you compute the aggregate sum of total goods, parang mas marami, halimbawa yung good in one person versus a group. Remember that the rule of majority is yung karamihan talaga yung kino-consider. Pero, in our utilitarianism, ang kino-consider is yung aggregate good kahit nasa iisang person versus yung good na mas konti na ma-enjoy ng mas maraming tao. If this happens, the morally good action is the action in favor of the individual. Okay. Impartiality principle places all persons involved under equal consideration. Okay. The principle of impartiality. It does not prioritize the agent, kaya hindi siya agent relative. If the maximum aggregate welfare is not beneficial to the agent, then it is the agent's moral duty to sacrifice his personal welfare in favor of the maximum aggregate welfare. See? Okay, so, in case na mas malaki yung good na mararanasan ng grupo compared doon sa agent of the action, then the moral duty of the agent is sacrifice for the higher good. Not the many, kasi baka ma-confuse na naman kayo. We are not talking of the many. We are talking of the aggregate good, which is possible na it could be in the benefit of the individual and not the group. Okay, I hope that is clear. Let's look at Jeremy Bentham's hedonistic utilitarianism. Hedonistic utilitarianism argues that the moral action that which produces the greatest amount of pleasure. Jeremy Bentham introduced a way of calculating alternative pleasures called the hedonistic calculus. For this reason, his hedonism is called quantitative utilitarianism. It uses the following criteria in measuring the quantity of pleasures and pain as well. So may mga criteria siya, no? Unang criteria, intensity. The more intense the pleasure, the greater the value of the pleasure. Duration. The longer the experience, the greater the value of the pleasure. So kung yung action mo is intense, okay, malaki ang points niyan. Sige. Kung duration, kung you enjoy the pleasure a longer time, malaki rin ang points. Okay? Pero halimbawa, malaki yung intense yung pleasure, bigyan natin siya ng points na 5. Pero yung duration ng pleasure is hindi momentary lang. Lagyan natin ng 1 point. Yan, gano'n. Certainty. The greater the probability that the pleasure will be experienced, the greater the value of the pleasure. Ano to? The probability that the pleasure will be experienced. Sure ka ba? No, hindi ibig sabihin na ini-imagine mo na pleasure to, sure ka na talagang may pleasure yan. No? Sometimes kasi we only see illusions. Okay? So, the more certain, the greater the value of the pleasure. So, sabihin natin, okay, certain siya. Sige, 4. Okay? Let's move to the other categories. Propinquity or remoteness. The shorter the time the pleasure is achieved after acting on it, the greater the value. May mga pleasure kasi na hindi mo pa makukuha yung pleasure sa ngayon. Okay? May mga pangyayari na anticipated yung pleasure. Like education. Education is anticipated pleasure kasi nagpupuyat ka, nag-e-exam ka, nagre-review ka. Yung pleasure na makukuha mo out of it will be when you get a good job. Okay. So, po-points mo yan. Fecundity. The higher the probability that the pleasure will be followed by more pleasures. Meaning, yung pleasure na yan, will it lead to more pleasures? Kasi may mga ginagawa kasi tayo na very pleasurable, pero after that, puro sakit na, no? Like pagbarbatek. Purity. Purity means the higher the probability that the pleasure will not be followed by pain, the higher the value of the pleasure. Ibig sabihin, pure yung pleasure mo kung wala siyang kahalong pain. Okay. May mga pleasure kasi na oo, pero in the end or in the long run, nakakasakit. No? You experience pain. And extent, gaano karami yung nabe-benefit. Okay. So, yan yung categories na lalagyan mo ng points. Positive for pleasure and negative for pain. And then, pwede mong balikan yung point system na ginawa natin dito. Okay, pwede yan. Remember this. Okay. So, the morally good action is the action that produces the higher positive units of value. The same applies to pains by using negative units of measurements. So the morally good action is the action that has lesser negative units of comparison to other pains. So, tinawag si Jeremy Bentham na yung view niya as quantitative utilitarianism. Bakit? Kasi nga, linagyan niya ng point system. Okay? Ngayon, yung isang representative ng utilitarianism natin is iba rin ang point niya. Qualitative utilitarianism siya, si John Stuart Mill. His version of utilitarianism is developed from his responses to the objections. By contrast, Mill's hedonism is qualitative utilitarianism. And the following are the 3 major objections to utilitarianism and how John Stuart Mill answered the objections. Dito nyo makikita yung kanyang type of utilitarianism. First criticism to utilitarianism. By using pleasure and pain as intrinsic values of goodness and badness, utilitarianism reduced the human on the level of animals. Yan ang sabi ng mga critics ng utilitarianism. Alam ko ito yung apprehension ninyo, no, sa consequentialist na para tayong animal na pleasure lang. Anong sabi ni Mill? Well, among humans, there is a difference between intellectual pleasure and physical pleasure, sabi niya. The capacity for reason refers to intelligence and free choice, while the capacity for sentience refers to sensory experience. Okay? So, ang punto ni Mill dito is, itong argument na to, ang tinitira lang niya is yung sensory experience. But Mill wants to say that there are intellectual pleasures and these are higher than physical pleasures. So utilitarianism can be saved because, well, as Mill argues, there is a difference between intellectual pleasure and physical pleasure. And this argument is only speaking of the physical pleasure. And Mill's utilitarianism is more focused on this, no, intellectual pleasure. Ito yung pinaka-famous na quotation ni Mill, no? Kakatuwa to. It is better to be human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Okay? Sometimes, ang dami nating reklamo, pero sabi ni Mill, it's better to be human and dissatisfied than satisfied ka nga, pero pig ka naman, di ba? Or, better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Socrates kasi was sentenced to death for teaching, enlightening the minds of the young. Okay? And for that reason, marami siyang nagawang kalaban. Okay? So he was sentenced to death. So Socrates died. Pero ano mas gugustuhin mo? Sabi niya, yung buhay ni Socrates na namatay for telling the truth or enlightening the young, or you just want to be a fool pero satisfied ka? Sasabihin sa'yo ni Mill, hindi. Mas maganda yung intellectual pleasure. Kahit na namatay si Socrates, for that, he was enjoying intellectual pleasure. And intellectual pleasure will always be higher than physical pleasure. Dito pala makikita ninyo why qualitative utilitarian si John Stuart Mill. Kasi yung quality ng pleasure, may kaibahan yung pleasure ng mind at saka pleasure ng physical. Okay. Quantitative si Bentham kasi nga may point system, quantity and quality. Okay. Moving on, second objection sa utilitarianism. Utilitarianism daw is bound to fail for lack of an objective basis to decide which type of pleasure is superior than other types. Mill's response: this can be done objectively through competent judges on the relative values of pleasure. And for him, competent judges are those who experience the entire spectrum of pleasures. So, for two pleasurable actions X and Y, the competent judge is the one who experiences both pleasures. Ibig sabihin, ang issue dito kasi is, wala namang objective basis on which pleasure is really higher than the other pleasure. Okay, di ba? Kasi nga, we may have different pleasures. Okay, we may have different pleasures. And what is pleasurable to you may not be pleasurable to me. Okay, so all you need to do, sabi ni Mill, is get a competent judge. And a competent judge is the one who experienced both. Okay, like, I experienced doing that and doing this, and for me, this is better. Yun daw ang competent judge. The third objection is utilitarianism cannot account for the moral goodness of martyrdom and self-sacrifice. Ito usually, di ba? Kasi nga, pain is bad, pleasure is good. Paano yung mga martyrs? Masaya silang namatay for their faith. They find pleasure in it. Pero hindi talaga yun pleasure, pain yun di ba? Yun ang issue. Paano yung self-sacrifice? Like, I am sacrificing myself to work, so that I can send my siblings, my brothers and sisters to school. Hindi ba good yan dahil pain yan? Okay, Mill's response. Utilitarianism is not agent-relative consequentialism. Again, remember, agent-relative is you consider only the feelings of the agent of the action. Pero utilitarianism is agent-neutral. Welfareist siya, no? tinitignan ng utilitarianism yung kabutihan, goodness sa pinakamaraming taong madadamay, hindi sa agent relative. So utilitarianism considers the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people, which means that sometimes it requires individuals to sacrifice their personal welfare, which is pasok na to. Yan. Okay? Okay. That ends the basic theories of utilitarianism, consequentialism. Epicureanism and utilitarianism. Utilitarianism as quantitative in Jeremy Bentham and qualitative in John Stuart Mill. That ends my third lecture. Thank you.